Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, get ready to dive into the Cold War. But hold on, we're not talking spies and bombs this time.
Nope.
Today, it's a battle for hearts and minds.
Ah,
You brought us a podcast, Mr. Hutchings History, and it's all about how the U.S. and the Soviets used propaganda to win over global opinion.
yeah, it's easy to think of the Cold War as just this big military standoff, but what often gets overlooked is this battle for hearts and minds happening at the same time.
So it wasn't just about having bigger weapons, they needed a better story, too.
Absolutely. Both sides knew that global influence wasn't just about military strength. It was about winning over the people, at home and abroad, especially in those new nations popping up in Africa and Asia.
Right, because these countries were choosing sides, deciding which system they wanted to follow.
Exactly, and that's where this battle for hearts and minds really played out. The U.S. obviously was pushing their democracy and capitalism, the promise of freedom, all that.
And the Soviets countered with.
Communism, of course. They really emphasized their whole equality thing, a classless society, directly challenging the inequalities of colonialism, which, resonated with a lot of those newly independent nations.
Okay, so we've got this global showdown of ideas. But here's where it gets interesting. The podcast we're looking at, it highlights how America's own issues with civil rights actually became a weapon for Soviet propaganda.
It's kind of ironic when you think about it.
Yeah, it's like they were handing it to them on a silver platter.
The Soviets were really quick to point out the hypocrisy, the U.S. talking about freedom and equality on the world stage while dealing with segregation at home.
So how could the U.S. be taken seriously when their own house wasn't in order? Talk about awkward.
Exactly. And the Soviets were so good at exploiting that. Imagine these newly independent nations, many just free from colonial rule, they're looking at the U.S. as a model. And then the Soviets come in and say, hey, look a little closer. These guys don't even treat their own citizens equally.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt. So what did the U.S. do?
They did something. The Mr. Hutchings podcast points to 48, Truman's decision to desegregate the military as a pivotal moment.
Huge moment in U.S. history, sure, but right in the middle of the Cold War, that had to be about more than just doing the right thing.
Right. Absolutely. It was a landmark decision driven by, I think, a real desire for progress and equality within the U.S., but it was also strategic, a direct response to the Soviets on the world stage.
So unpack that a bit. We're talking about the U.S. military, this global force, a symbol of American power, and it's segregated. While they're preaching equality, that's a tough sell.
Totally. It completely undermined their message, and the Soviets knew it. Truman's decision to desegregate, it was a way to address that hypocrisy head on. It was about reclaiming the moral high ground, strengthening their image abroad, especially in the eyes of those newly independent countries.
So was it purely strategic then? Or purely about equality at home?
It's rarely that simple, isn't it? The Mr. Hutchings episode does a good job of highlighting how different historians see it. From the orthodox to the revisionist, some see it as a brilliant Cold War move, others a genuine step towards racial equality. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
A calculated risk, maybe?
Perhaps. But whatever the reasons, Truman's move was a turning point. It shifted the narrative, at least a little. But the propaganda battle, that was far from over.
And I'm guessing the Soviets had a few more tricks up their sleeve.
Oh, absolutely. We'll get into how both sides really ramped up their propaganda machines next.
So we're back, and we left off talking about how both sides really amped up the propaganda game.
Yeah.
What did that look like? What were some of the actual tools they were using?
Well, the Soviets, they had this thing, the Soviet Information Bureau, Cominform for short.
Kitschy. What was that exactly?
Think of it like their main hub for spreading the Soviet message, especially in Europe and the developing world. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, magazines, all pushing that Soviet perspective, and often, taking shots at the U.S.
So kind of like going viral 20th century style.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
They knew how to reach a mass audience, how to shape the story, and they were good at it. Relentless, quick to react, strategic with their messaging, knew how to tailor it for different audiences.
Okay, so what about the U.S.? They weren't just sitting back, right?
No, but they were playing catch-up for a while there. Remember, the U.S., they had this whole tradition of a free press, so government-controlled propaganda. It was a little iffy for them.
Yeah, a little Big Brother-ish.
Yeah.
But they had to do something to counter the Soviets, right?
Yeah. They did. In '53, they created the USIA, the United States Information Agency, and that became their main tool for public diplomacy.
Their mission, their goal was to
Promote America, basically.
Got
Counter
it.
all that Soviet propaganda going around, setting up libraries, doing cultural exchanges, making films, radio programs, anything to show the good side of democracy and capitalism.
Sounds a little familiar, like what the Soviets were doing.
A bit, yeah. But the USIA, they always had this extra hurdle. The Soviets, they could just, make up their own version of reality. But the US, they were kind of stuck with, well, reality, like racial inequality back home. Hard to square that with a message of freedom for all.
Yeah, actions speak louder than words.
And the Soviets, they were masters at using those contradictions against the US. The Mr. Hutchings episode, it gives this great example, Sputnik.
Sputnik, first satellite, right? 57. Big deal for the Soviets.
Huge. Not just the technology, but what it represented. This little metal ball built by the Soviets orbiting the Earth, it captured everyone's imagination and, of course, became a symbol of Soviet technological superiority.
And this is right in the thick of the Cold War, remember, when people were seriously worried about nuclear war. Suddenly the Soviets weren't just catching up, they were pulling ahead. And not in a small way either.
Exactly. And they knew how to use it. Soviet propaganda went into overdrive saying, see, this proves the communist system is better. It fed right into their narrative a communist future was inevitable.
Bet that went over well in Washington.
Oh yeah, total anxiety attack. They realized they were behind not just in space, but in this battle for hearts and minds too.
So we've talked about strategies and institutions. But what did this hearts and minds thing actually look like in action? How did they try to win over everyday people?
That's where it gets really interesting. The Soviets, for example, they were really good at using culture as a tool.
Go on.
They'd send their best artists on world tours, especially to developing countries, ballerinas, musicians, you name it. But these weren't just performances. They were carefully crafted displays of Soviet talent and culture.
Trying to show how much better Soviet culture was.
Exactly. Soft power. Take ballet, for example. They'd showcase their best ballerinas, some of the best in the world, really, and project this image of Soviet grace, discipline, artistry.
I'm guessing that went over better with some folks than a lecture about communism.
Oh, absolutely. Subtle but effective. And get this. The U.S. tried to do the same thing, but with jazz.
Now that's a twist. American jazz fighting the Cold War.
Well, remember, this is the time of Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong. The U.S. realized they could use jazz, this symbol of American creativity and freedom, to counter the Soviet narrative.
So they were fighting back, but with music.
Exactly. They'd sponsored jazz tours all over the world, especially places where the Soviets were gaining influence. It was a way to show a different side of America, a cooler side, you could say.
So ballet versus jazz. Competing ideologies. A global struggle for influence. This Cold War hearts and minds thing, it's anything but boring. But what does it all mean for us now? What's the takeaway?
That's the question, isn't it? The Cold War is history. But this battle for hearts and minds, I don't think that ever really ends.
We'll be back in just a moment to unpack that thought. Don't go anywhere. So we went deep on Cold War propaganda, ballet versus jazz, a global battle for hearts and minds. But this wasn't just some history lesson, right? This idea of information as a weapon, that feels, really relevant today.
It is, more than ever. I mean, think about it. We've gone from radio waves and newspapers to, social media feeds. But the core idea, it's the same.
You're saying we're in a modern-day propaganda war, just, with fancier tech.
Kind of, yeah. We're drowning in information. Governments, political parties, even corporations, they're all fighting for our attention, trying to get us to think a certain way, make certain choices. Same game, different platform, I guess you could say.
Little overwhelming when you put it like that.
Ah.
So what do? Anything we can learn from those Cold War propaganda wars, to help us navigate this whole information overload?
That's the big question. And that Mr. Hutchings History podcast, it actually offers a good answer, even if it's kind of subtle. He says one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of, just thinking critically.
Okay, critical thinking. We hear that a lot. But in this context, what does that actually look like?
It means not believing everything you see or read. Look at the source. Ask yourself who benefits from this. And maybe most important, try to see different sides of the story, not just the one you already agree with.
Easy to get stuck in echo chambers, especially online. surrounded by people who think like we do.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to get out of those echo chambers, challenge your own biases, be open to other viewpoints. Just like back in the Cold War, the information we let in, it shapes how we see the world. And with so much information out there now, that's powerful stuff. And yeah, maybe a little dangerous too.
Makes you think twice about every headline, every social media post, everything really.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I hope people listening, that's what they take away from this. That this fight for hearts and minds, it didn't end when the Cold War did. It's still going on. And the best weapon we've got, our own ability to think for ourselves, to question, and to really talk to each other.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. And for everyone listening, here's something to ponder. If we had to pick a modern-day version of this Cold War propaganda battle, what would it be? Who would be the players? And who's winning? Think about it. And we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep those questions coming, and keep those brains engaged.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.